My dad's girlfriend rushed to the hospital after my accident, but I screamed I only wanted him. Now she barely speaks to me. I was 13 the first time I really understood how badly I'd wanted a stable parental figure for all my life. My father had always existed in my mind as this heroic figure I saw far too rarely until I was placed in his custody. Someone kind and caring, but also busy and always fighting battles for me I couldn't even see, let alone join. And my birth mother? I used to carry around an image of her in my heart, battered and confused, but not exactly unloving, just too lost in her own life to keep me safe. Life as a child of a single teen mom had been chaotic. And looking back, I can see the sorrow in every decision she had to make. But as a little kid, there's only so much your mind can process about addiction and lost opportunities, about courts that make choices on your behalf, about grandparents who turned out to be not as supportive as they should have been. When I was very young, my grandparents, my birth mom's parents, made her keep me when she was clearly too young to be responsible for another life. They didn't allow her to graduate from high school because they more or less demanded she pay rent. And as soon as she hit 18 and couldn't come up with the money fast enough, they threw both of us out. She had nowhere to go, and she slipped into drug use, maybe to cope, maybe out of despair. I don't know the exact reasons. I just know the result. I ended up in and out of messy living situations for years, often not knowing what was going on except that my mother wasn't always there. The scariest part was how her eyes changed when she was high. It felt like a stranger inhabited her body, and I was this child trying so desperately to figure out why that person in front of me had all my mother's features and none of her warmth. Eventually, my father was contacted. It took a while because my mother, in her haze, had lost track of how to get in touch with him. When the courts became involved after a very public incident, something I barely remember, but it apparently involved the cops being called because I was left alone in a motel for days, he came to the rescue. He was with another woman back then, and my presence as a young child was definitely not part of their life plans. She wasn't cruel, but she was honest that motherhood wasn't what she wanted. Not at that point. Not ever. My dad, though, made the choice to become the father I needed. I think he would have anyway, but her stance sped up the breakdown of their relationship. It wasn't even a matter of choose me or your kid. She simply knew she would never accept being a parent, and he couldn't give me up. He turned his life around and made me his priority, and I adored him for it. He made sure I had everything I needed: medical care, schooling, a stable roof over my head, and a sense of normalcy I'd never quite felt before. For me, that meant the world. What's tricky about all this is that somehow, as I got older, I realized I was forming double standards in my head. My mother had also tried. I know that. She sacrificed a lot, even if it never ended up in a healthy place for either of us. Addiction is a terrible disease, and love isn't always enough to keep someone on the straight and narrow. So I can't help but ask myself sometimes, why do I treat her sacrifices and failures so differently than I do my dad's? Maybe it's because he's always been consistent. He stayed. Even if we were physically apart, he was emotionally present once he knew he had a daughter who needed him. My mother's presence was always in question. I'd get glimpses, moments when she was sober and sweet and determined to fight the addiction, but it never lasted long enough for me to trust that she could be what I needed. Time marched on. By the time I was 15, my dad had a new girlfriend. They'd been dating for a little over a year, and he was happier than I'd seen him in a long time. This woman was kind of quiet around me, maybe shy. To be honest, we just didn't have much in common. She was big into things like yoga and cooking classes and romantic comedies, while I was into more active sports, art, and hanging out with my friends. I spent most of my time at school, after-school clubs, or in my bedroom FaceTiming people. She was polite and pleasant, never once rude, but we didn't exactly bond. Still, I recognized that the relationship was important to him. I also realized that in a few years I'd be off to college or whatever path I chose, and it wasn't my place to rock the boat by demanding more attention or anything like that. I suppose somewhere in the back of my mind I thought that, after I moved out, maybe we'd develop a friendlier relationship, like the kind where I'd come home to visit Dad on holidays and we'd all chat around the table. Maybe we'd laugh about silly memories or inside jokes. But I never imagined she'd try to be my mom. The idea felt weird. I didn't want a new mother, I just wanted to keep the peace. Then came the accident. This was a few months ago, still recent enough that I'm grappling with the aftermath every day. We were in gym class. Let me set the stage. I'd been in a sort of rivalry with this classmate for months. We were both the type who liked to win at any cost, always pushing ourselves in everything from tests to sports. On that particular day, it was supposed to be a friendly scrimmage. In fact, the coach had specifically told us not to get too competitive. But you can guess how well that turned out. We both went for the ball. Soccer ball, basketball, whatever the actual sport was didn't matter, because we ended up tangling our legs, our arms. There was a split second when I felt my knee twist in a way it absolutely shouldn't. Then gravity took over, and as we slammed to the ground, she fell right on top of. The impact was catastrophic. I remember the searing pain in my right knee. My vision exploded with sparks as something in my leg gave way, and I could feel the joint contort. Then, as I hit the ground face first, I felt something crunch in my nose and around my eye. Blinding agony. Everything blurred, and I think I even blacked out for a second or two. By the time I came to, I was gasping, tears streaming down my face trying to figure out why I couldn't straighten my leg. My face felt hot and wet. Blood, I realized. My classmate was lying next to me, half conscious, groaning in pain. She'd smacked her head and ended up with cracked ribs. Later, I would learn she had one of the worst bruises of her life on her thigh, plus a straddle injury that left her in PT for months. The guilt I felt after learning how badly I'd hurt her was like an anchor pulling me down every single day. But in that moment, I was too consumed by my own pain to think about anything else. Teachers rushed over. Someone was yelling for the nurse, for the paramedics. Kids were shouting, and everything got very loud. Then very quiet for a few moments as I tried to comprehend the throbbing, slicing pain in my leg and face. When the school nurse arrived, I vaguely remember hearing her speak in calming tones, telling me to breathe slowly, to keep still. That help was on its way. But all I could really focus on was the unstoppable tears and the absolute panic gripping my chest. The worst part of it, at least in my memory, is that I remember shrieking for my dad. That was the first name that popped into my head. Dad. I wanted him, needed him, like a little kid crying after scraping a knee. I didn't care that I was 15, supposedly mature enough to handle emergencies. All I knew was that Dad had always been the one to make me feel safe. When the paramedics finally arrived, they tried to stabilize me. They asked for an emergency contact. The teacher had my dad's number, but he was almost out of state for work, a good 2-hour drive away, maybe more. So they called him right away. And he told the school to contact his girlfriend too, because she was the second adult in the household and someone who could come with me to the hospital. Now here's the part that I keep replaying in my head over and over. I was in shock, in pain, tears pouring out of my eyes, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. And I was basically screaming at anyone who would listen that I didn't want her. I specifically said over and over that I wanted my dad, nobody else. They told me she was on her way, that she could ride in the ambulance, that she could give consent for treatment until he arrived. But I wouldn't hear it. I just kept crying, no, 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 I want my dad. Even when she actually showed up, my vision was so blurry from tears that I barely recognized her at first. I was adamant I didn't want her near me. It was like some primal, irrational part of me refused her comfort or presence. In my agony and confusion, I couldn't grasp that this was the next best thing to having my father there. I think on some level I was terrified. Something had broken inside me. Everything was spinning out of control, and all I wanted was the single point of stability I trusted. It must have been humiliating for her. All these school staff members, paramedics, other students, possibly even parents of my classmates watching as this 15-year-old girl, her boyfriend's daughter, screamed, "Get away! I only want my dad." I was inconsolable and borderline hysterical. The paramedics had to sedate me eventually so they could properly examine my injuries, strap me onto the stretcher, and get me loaded into the ambulance. So that's how the dynamic with her changed. Before that, it was distant but cordial. After that day, she barely spoke to me. And it wasn't just for a week or two. It's been months, and I feel this giant wall of ice between us that I don't know how to thaw. When I got to the hospital, I was in and out of consciousness. I vaguely remember hearing her voice in the hallway, talking to a nurse, explaining that Dad was on his way. The doctors needed immediate permission to proceed with certain scans and treatments, but I hadn't known that at the time. All I knew was that I'd told her, in front of everyone, that I didn't want her anywhere near me. Eventually, Dad arrived, breathless and worried. He stayed by my bedside, holding my hand and stroking my hair while I cried through the pain. The next few days were a blur of doctor visits, MRIs, X-rays, scheduling surgery, all that. I had a tear in my ACL, a moderate sprain in my MCL, a torn lining in my hip joint, a blowout fracture around my eye socket, and a broken nose. On top of that, a non-displaced fracture in my femur. It was a litany of injuries that made me feel like my body was a marionette whose strings had all been cut in one instant. My classmate, the one who fell on me, ended up with a bad concussion, cracked ribs, and severe bruising that required her own physical therapy. The guilt gnawed at my insides. I'd call or text her, apologizing for the accident, but she was in no mental place to respond. Her parents were furious, probably at both of us, but I wondered if they saw me as the villain. I knew I had some responsibility for the collision, but part of me also knew she had been playing rough too. I tried not to dwell on it, but it festered in my thoughts late at night. Throughout my initial hospital stay, Dad's girlfriend visited exactly once, and even then, she hovered near the doorway, barely saying a word. She brought a bag with some comfortable clothes and my phone charger, set it on the chair, and left within minutes. I remember the sting in my chest, realizing how thoroughly I'd alienated her. Because truly, I didn't hate her. I never did. I was just in pain and wanting my dad. But as a 15-year-old, the capacity for empathy sometimes gets buried beneath the avalanche of raw emotion, and I had absolutely no filter in that moment. When I came home, life was messy. I couldn't walk without crutches for a while, and even then, it was slow going, with each step sending shards of pain up my leg and into my hip. My face was swollen, sporting a black eye that wouldn't fade for weeks. Plus, I had this rigid cast-like brace on my knee. I felt monstrous, angry at the world, and most nights, I cried myself to sleep, feeling sorry for everything. The pain, the inconvenience to Dad, the awkwardness in the house. Dad took time off work to help me recover. He'd help me get up, fix me snacks or meals, talk to me about how I was healing, drive me to physical therapy, though eventually he had to go back to his job. And that's when she stepped in. Except she did it in the most basic, no-frills way possible. She'd wake me up at set times for my pain medication, maybe bring me water, then disappear into another room. She wouldn't really ask me if I needed anything else, and she certainly wouldn't hang around to chat. The few times I tried to say, "Thank you," or "Good morning," her responses were subdued, polite but cold. It started to dawn on me that I'd really hurt her feelings. Maybe I even embarrassed her so badly that she decided I was never going to accept her, so she'd keep her distance. Which, ironically, was the opposite of what I wanted. My meltdown during the accident hadn't been a statement about how I felt about her as a person. It was just an expression of pure panic. But how do you explain that after the fact? I didn't want you there because I was in so much pain I couldn't think rationally. It sounds like an excuse, and I wasn't sure if she'd believe me or even care to hear it. Weeks passed, and I ended up needing surgery to repair my ACL. Dad was anxious, pacing around the hospital as they prepped. She was there too, but she hovered with her arms crossed, looking almost frightened to catch my eye. I tried to say, "Hey, good morning," but she simply nodded and managed a faint "hi" before stepping back. Dad noticed, obviously. He's not oblivious. He'd occasionally give me these questioning looks, like he wanted to ask what happened or what was wrong. But I wasn't ready to spill the whole story. I was afraid of looking like an ungrateful brat or worse, hurting him by revealing that I might have sabotaged his relationship. Sometimes at night I'd wonder, was she planning to marry him at some point? Was I screwing up any potential future he had with her? He deserved happiness. He'd sacrificed so much for me. If I was the reason she pulled away from him, or if I caused a rift in their bond, could I live with that guilt? I mean, maybe she was simply giving me space to recover. Or maybe she was actively withdrawing from me and from him because she felt unwelcome. It was so complicated, and I felt too immature to handle it. Once I was back at home recovering from the surgery, the tension became almost unbearable. There'd be days when Dad was at work and she'd be the only other person around. I'd be stuck on the couch with my crutches, my leg propped up, physically unable to do much. I'd hear her moving around in the kitchen or the living room, but she wouldn't come talk to me. If I called out, "Hey, could I have some help?" she'd come into the room, quietly ask me what I needed, do the bare minimum, and then leave again. It stung. I started to notice little changes in how she referred to me. Before the accident, she'd sometimes call me by the same nickname Dad uses. Other times, she used a different playful variation of my name, like Mads or Lex. It was something I hadn't even realized I appreciated until it vanished. Now, she strictly used my full name. It felt formal and stiff, almost like speaking to a coworker you don't really know or like. Every time I heard it, it was like a reminder of the boundary I'd erected between us that day when I was screaming on the gym floor. I'd lie awake at night, replaying the scene in my head. The worst of it was hearing my own voice, shrill and desperate. "I don't want her. I just want my dad." I'd imagine how she must have felt, stepping onto the scene in front of the entire school staff, only to have me reject her. I felt so stupid, so mortified, but I was also too scared to apologize. I thought maybe enough time would pass that we could just move on. That eventually, once I was healed, we'd find a way back to the neutral, polite dynamic we'd had before. But days dragged on, and the silence between us grew thicker. Dad definitely noticed. He'd sometimes pull me aside, gentle concern in his eyes, and say things like, "Hey, I feel like there's some tension in the house. Are you okay, kiddo?" And I'd lie, every single time. "No, Dad, I'm fine. Just tired." Or, "I'm just sore from therapy." Or, "No, it's nothing, really." Then he'd sigh and let it drop. Meanwhile, I'd see him giving her the same worried looks. I wondered if they argued about me in private. Did she tell him how hurt she was? Or was she too proud to admit it? My physical therapy sessions were grueling. I do exercises to strengthen my knee and hip, endless stretches that felt like torture. Sometimes Dad would take me, sometimes she'd drop me off but refuse to come in. She'd just wait in the car, scrolling through her phone, while I was inside struggling with a trainer, or lying there trying not to cry from the pain. Sometimes I'd look out the window and see her face through the windshield, distant and unreadable. I got to the point where I was sick of it, this tension, this unspoken rift. I wanted to talk to her, but I didn't know how. One afternoon, after Dad had gone to work and before my physical therapy, I gathered what little courage I had. I found her in the kitchen, washing dishes in a methodical way, her shoulders tense. I came in, awkwardly maneuvering on my crutches, clearing my throat to announce my presence. She turned off the faucet and looked at me with that calm, polite expression. "Do you need something?" she asked evenly. Not unkind, but not warm either. My heart hammered in my chest. I felt like a little kid about to confess to a teacher that I'd cheated on a test. I just wanted to talk to you. My voice faltered. She stared, waiting, her posture stiff. I know things have been weird between us since my accident, and I wanted to say I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings. She exhaled, put down the sponge, and folded her arms over her chest. You were in pain. I understand that. But that's not an excuse, I insisted. I know you came to help, and I basically shoved you away. I wasn't thinking at all. I was so caught up in wanting Dad, but I wasn't trying to say I hate you or anything. I'm just sorry. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something that cut me deeper than I expected. I wanted to be there for you, she said quietly. I know I'm not your mother, but I care about your dad, and I care about you because you're his daughter. When I got that phone call, my heart was pounding the whole drive to the school. I was worried about you, and when I got there, you screamed at me to leave. There was a tightness in my throat. I know. God, I'm so sorry. I'm not mad exactly, she continued. I just realized maybe I've been fooling myself thinking that you might ever be comfortable with me being around. I tried to keep some distance because I thought you needed space. But it's hard to keep trying when I feel I've already been rejected. My eyes stung. I never meant to reject you, I said. I just wasn't ready for you to fill in for Dad, I guess. But I should have let you. I was in so much pain I wasn't in my right mind. Still, I know that doesn't erase the fact that you were trying to help, and I turned you away in front of everyone. She sighed softly and looked down at her hands. It was humiliating, but more than that, it hurt, because I do love your dad. And I was hoping maybe you and I could get along. I took a shaky breath. We can? Or at least, I'd like to try. I feel awful about this, and I want to fix it, but I don't know how. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The kitchen was silent except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Then she nodded. Well, it's a start that you came to me. I appreciate that. My relief was so intense that my knees, well, my good knee, almost bucked. I remember swallowing around the lump in my throat, determined not to cry. Thank you, I whispered. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this better. She gave me a small, tentative smile. Let's just talk sometimes, okay? If you need help, don't be afraid to ask. And I'll try to be more open, too. I nodded vigorously. Deal. That was the first honest conversation we'd had since the accident. It felt like a tiny patch over a gaping wound, but at least it was something. That night at dinner, for the first time in forever, she asked me about my physical therapy. It wasn't much, just a simple, "How's your leg feeling today? Any improvement?" But the softness in her voice made me feel like maybe I wasn't a monster for what I'd done at school. Dad looked between us, clearly sensing the shift in atmosphere. He didn't press the issue, but I could tell he was relieved. Over the next few days, we slowly built on that small thaw. She'd check on me more frequently, ask if I needed anything. I'd make an effort to say thank you, and good night, and good morning, trying not to let my discomfort show. Because let's face it, I was still embarrassed, and she was probably still hurt. But she was making a conscious effort to move past it, so I did the same. We weren't best friends, obviously, but at least it wasn't that suffocating silence. Eventually, Dad cornered me in my room. He perched on the edge of my bed, wearing that concerned dad face, arms folded. All right, kiddo. I can see things are improving with you two, but I need to know what happened. I sighed, hugging my pillow to my chest. When I was at school, I was in so much pain, Dad. I wasn't thinking, and I was freaking out. The paramedics wanted her to go with me in the ambulance, but I kept refusing. I screamed a bunch of stuff about not wanting her, only wanting you. I guess she felt pretty awful, and she's been distant ever since. He closed his eyes for a moment. Yeah, she mentioned something like that. She said you were hysterical, but she also felt like you truly didn't want her there, that you couldn't stand the idea of her. I felt tears burning my eyes again. I don't hate her. At that moment, I wanted you, and no one else. She was trying to help, and I practically shoved her away. I've apologized to her now, and we're working on it, I guess. I just hope she forgives me. My dad pulled me into a gentle hug, careful of my injuries. You're young and you were scared. I'm not mad, and I don't think she is either. But I'm glad you two are talking. I love you, and I love her, and I want us all to be a family if we can. Me too, I whispered, resting my chin on his shoulder. That conversation lifted a huge weight from my chest. It also confirmed that Dad had known all along that something big had gone down, but he'd given me space to figure it out. I appreciated that. One day, a few weeks later, my physical therapist suggested I try using only one crutch at home to build strength. It was exciting, but scary. My knee still twinged with every step, but it was progress. That afternoon, Dad's girlfriend, let's call her Jill for the sake of clarity, was the one who picked me up from therapy. She asked how it went, and I told her the new routine. We got back to the house, and she lingered near me as I hobbled inside. Do you need an arm? She offered, holding hers out. I paused, feeling a jolt of awkwardness, but I managed to nod. Sure, yeah. I looped my hand around her forearm, letting her steady me as I navigated the steps into the living room. My heart beat wildly because this was the first time she'd really touched me in any supportive way since before the accident. When I finally sank onto the couch, I thanked her softly. She smiled, a bit more warmly than before. It was a small moment, but it felt like a major break. I realized how much I craved that sense of acceptance, even from someone who wasn't my mom. Just having another adult care about my well-being felt good, and for the first time, I thought, maybe it's possible for us to have more than polite distance. Maybe we can be friends someday. Over the next few days, Jill started initiating more conversations. She'd knock on my door before Dad got home, asking if I was hungry or if I wanted to watch a movie. I usually said yes, even if I wasn't super interested in the show or the meal. I wanted to show her that I was willing to try. Slowly, I learned more about her as a person, her hobbies, the places she'd traveled, the fact that she'd grown up in a large family but always felt overshadowed by older siblings, so she'd vowed to find her own path. Part of that included not having kids because she'd always felt like she was forced to be the caretaker for her younger sisters. She admitted she never expected to fall in love with someone who had a child, especially a teenager. But she loved my dad enough to accept that being with him meant being part of my life too. I found myself opening up more about my own insecurities. I told her about how I felt guilty about my mother, how I sometimes worried that maybe I'd inherited some predisposition for addiction or that I'd fail in life the way my mother had. Jill was sympathetic, never once judging me or my mom. I appreciated that. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. We still had moments of awkwardness. Sometimes she'd make a decision about dinner or weekend plans, and I'd feel a little overshadowed, like, oh, this is her stepping into a mom role I'm not ready for. But I'd remind myself that she was just trying to help, to be useful, to support Dad and me. Other times, I'd catch her hesitating, as if she was afraid to cross a line. Maybe she'd come in to see if I needed help with laundry and stop short, remembering the day I screamed at her. That tension was still there, just overshadowed by our mutual desire to move forward. Meanwhile, my guilt about the classmate I injured was still simmering in the back of my mind. One day, Jill asked if I'd heard from her recently. I shook my head. Not really. I sent her a few messages. She left me on read. I can't blame her. I did cause her serious harm. You were both being rough. It sounds like you both took it too far, Jill said gently. But maybe she'll come around. People heal in different ways, and maybe she's still working through her own feelings about it. I just wish I could fix things, I murmured. I feel like I messed up so many things with that stupid accident. Jill put a hand on my shoulder. Hey, life happens. You're young. You're allowed to make mistakes. It's how you handle them afterward that counts. I realized she was speaking from experience. She'd come into my life, presumably prepared to handle being with a man who had a child, but not fully ready for the reality of what that entailed. My outbursts, my complicated emotions, my unwavering loyalty to my dad. Yet here she was, trying. Eventually, Dad and Jill suggested we all sit down together. Really, sit down and talk. They waited for a weekend afternoon when I wasn't in too much pain and Dad wasn't traveling for work. I was nervous, but I sensed it might be the final step in clearing the air. We settled around the kitchen table. Dad looked serious. Jill looked a bit anxious. My leg was in a brace, but I was more mobile by then, so I sat comfortably, trying not to jiggle it with nerves. Dad started. So, I know things have been getting better. I'm really proud of both of you for trying to work through this. But let's make sure we're all on the same page about what happened and how we can move forward. I glanced at Jill, and she gave me a small nod, as if to say, go ahead. So I spoke up. I explained in detail how the accident had made me panic, how I'd lashed out in pain, how I never intended to hurt or reject her. I told them both about how I'd felt horrible ever since, scared I'd ruined our chance at any kind of relationship. I admitted that lying to Dad about everything being fine was just me being terrified of letting him down again. Dad reached over and squeezed my hand. You didn't let me down, he said softly. I just wanted you safe and happy. When I heard about your accident, all I could think was how fast I needed to get to you. I asked Jill to go because I trusted her to look after you until I got there. My voice trembled. I know. And I threw that trust back in her face. I'm sorry. Jill cleared her throat. I appreciate the apology. I truly do. And I'm sorry for pulling away so much after. I guess I felt that I'd overstepped by thinking I could be a stand-in for your dad. I was disappointed in myself for thinking maybe we had a closer connection. But that was silly of me too, because we never actually talked about what our relationship was. And you're going through so much already. The accident, the injuries, everything with your birth mother's side. I shouldn't have taken your reaction so personal. I shook my head vigorously. No, you had every right to be upset. I publicly embarrassed you, basically. I was rude, and it was wrong. I just want you to know I really am grateful you came. Even if I didn't show it then, or if I acted like the opposite was true. Dad let out a slow breath. Thank you, both of you. I'm guessing we all want the same thing. Peace in this house, maybe even a sense of family. I know Jill isn't trying to replace your mother, but I do love her, and I'd like you two to have a good relationship. Whatever that looks like for you both. Friends, step-parent and stepchild, or something else entirely. A silence settled over the table. I stared at my hands, noticing the small scars on my knuckles from the fall. Finally, Jill reached out and placed her hand near mine. Not quite touching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence. I'd like to be someone you can turn to, she said softly. Not instead of your dad, but in addition. If you need advice, help, or just a ride to therapy without awkward silence, I'm here. My chest felt tight with emotion. I blinked away the tears. I appreciate that. And I promise, I'm going to try to be more open. I'm not used to having another adult I can rely on, aside from Dad. But I'll work on it. Dad's eyes gleamed with relief and happiness. He placed his hands over both of ours, forming a little circle on the table. Good. That's all I ask. After that talk, the air in the house felt lighter. Jill and I still had our quirks. She remained more of a quiet, thoughtful person, and I was still a moody teenager with occasional flare-ups of pain and frustration. But the difference was that we didn't avoid each other any. We'd watch movies together, share snacks, occasionally chat about our days. She'd even ask about my friends, and I'd surprise myself by venting about typical teenage drama. She wasn't my mother, and I wasn't her child, but we found a comfortable middle ground that didn't need labels. At some point, Jill asked if I wanted to learn how to cook a few dishes with her. She said it might help me with meal prep once I was more independent at college. The old me might have shrugged and avoided it, but I decided to try. We had fun picking out recipes, messing up half the time, and occasionally making something edible. It gave us common ground, something to bond over beyond just, we both love my dad. The difference was noticeable enough that even my physical therapist picked up on my improved mood. When you're happier, your body recovers better, or so they say. Over time, I went from using 2 crutches to 1 crutch to a brace, to eventually limping on my own, and then hardly limping at all. My face healed, though I still get the occasional twinge around my eye socket. My nose looks a little different now, but I've learned to deal with it. The guilt about my classmate lingered. Still does sometimes, but I managed to send her one final heartfelt apology. She eventually texted me back, short and curt, but it was a reply at least. She said she forgave me, though she still felt upset about missing out on part of the season for our school sports. I told her I understood and wouldn't push any further. It's not like we became best friends, but at least I knew she didn't hate me. One day, Jill and I were waiting for Dad to come home from work. I was lying on the couch, scrolling through my phone, and she was flipping through a magazine. After a while, she spoke up. Hey, are you excited to go back to school next month? I shrugged. Nervous mostly. I'm still not at 100% physically, but I miss my friends, and I miss having a routine. She smiled. You'll do great, I'm sure. I hesitated, then smiled back. Thanks, Jill. It was the first time I'd spoken her name casually, almost affectionately. I think before then, I'd usually just said Dad's girlfriend, or avoided addressing her direct. She didn't comment on it, but I could see in her eyes that it mattered to her. That night, Dad came home and we all ate dinner together. Jill asked me about my day, and I told her about some random TV show I'd watched. We joked, we laughed a little. It felt normal, good. I realized with a mild shock that this kind of evening was exactly what I'd used to envy when I was younger. Families sitting together, discussing their days, caring about each other. Sure, we had our baggage and I was still healing, but there was genuine warmth. I'm not going to say everything wrapped up in a neat bow after that. Life is complicated. My knee still acts up on cold days. My mother remains distant, occasionally popping up in my thoughts with a wave of conflicting emotions. Sometimes Jill and I revert to awkwardness, especially if she tries to give me advice I didn't ask. But in those moments, one of us eventually breaks the tension by talking it out. We're learning to communicate, which might be the most important skill of all. Dad, for his part, seems happier and more at ease. He no longer gives me those worried stares when he leaves the house. Jill no longer avoids me in the hallway or addresses me with overly formal words. There are even times she's used a nickname again, cautiously, as if waiting to see if I mind. I don't. In fact, I find I kind of like it. It reminds me that she cares enough to be affectionate. I used to think I'd ruined any chance of a relationship with her by screaming in front of everyone that I didn't want her. But maybe relationships aren't so fragile that one painful moment dooms them forever. Or maybe we just cared enough about Dad and, eventually, about each other to push through that humiliation. Now, looking back on it all, I can see that day at school with more perspective. Yes, it was scary and painful, but it was also the catalyst for growth. In a strange way, it forced Jill and me to confront how we felt about each other, instead of skating by with superficial niceness. It was messy, it was awful, but it led us to a better understanding. And if there's a moral to this story, it's that sometimes you have to break before you can rebuild stronger. My knee, ironically, will never be quite the same, but it's stable enough for me to walk, maybe even run with enough therapy. My relationship with Jill was never something I truly valued until I saw how easily it could be torn apart, and we rebuilt it. Better than the half-hearted bond we'd had before. I wish I hadn't hurt my classmate. I still hate that I caused her so much pain. But I accept that we both played a part in the accident, and we both have to live with the aftermath. Life can't be undone. All we can do is learn from our mistakes and move on. Dad told me once, we all screw up. The measure of a person is how they handle it afterward. I think about that a lot. I might have handled it poorly at first, but now I've tried to do better. Jill has too, and maybe that's enough to give us a hopeful future. Sometimes late at night, I still get flashes of that memory. Me on the gym floor, screaming in anguish, the taste of blood in my mouth, the swirl of paramedic uniforms, and Jill's face standing off to the side looking helpless. I might always carry some regret for that day, but at least I know that day didn't define us forever. With honesty, vulnerability, and apologies on both sides, we found a way to move on. We're not a perfect family, but we're here for each other. And in the end, that's what matters. Dad found happiness with someone who genuinely loves him and is willing to accept me, complicated as I am. I found someone else in my corner, maybe not a mother figure exactly, but a supportive adult who wants what's best for me. And that feels like more than I used to think I'd ever have. As for the future, I'm 15 now, and time is flying. In a few years, I'll be off to college or starting a job or traveling the world. Who knows? But I don't dread leaving home. If anything, I feel better knowing Dad won't be lonely. He has Jill, someone who loves him enough to endure my teenage moods. And if I visit during holidays, I won't walk into a house filled with tension or forced politeness. I'll walk in and probably get a warm greeting, maybe a hug, and Jill will ask, "How was the drive?" And I'll say, "Exhausting, but worth it." We'll gather around the kitchen and laugh about old times. I used to fear I was screwing up Dad's life, preventing him from having a loving relationship. But as it turns out, the only one who could truly sabotage that relationship was me, if I refused to let anyone else in. By acknowledging my mistakes, apologizing, and being open to moving on, I learned that people can forgive, even if they're deeply hurt. It's not easy, but it's possible. In the end, I guess that's the logical conclusion to all this. I messed up, and I hurt someone who was only trying to help me. But we worked through it. And I learned that relationships can be repaired with empathy, honesty, and time. Dad has his chance at happiness. Jill and I have our chance to form a unique bond, and I can move forward with the knowledge that I'm not inherently a destroyer of good things. I just needed to grow, to talk, and to let someone else into my life. And that's what I'm doing now, one careful step at a time, just like my physical therapy taught. Each step can feel uncertain, but if I keep moving forward, I'll reach a place of strength and stability. I'm grateful for that, and for Dad, and for Jill, and strangely, even for the accident that showed me how much I still needed to learn about love, family, and forgiveness. It's a work in progress, but at least now, we're doing the work together.